I hadn't realized I'd left it there. The journal, small and unassuming, sat in the middle of the coffee table, its soft leather cover slightly worn from years of use. I had meant to put it away, to keep it hidden like I always did, but the doorbell had rung, and in my rush to answer it, I'd forgotten. By the time I came back into the living room, Nathan was standing over the table, the journal open in his hands. "What's this?" he asked, his voice light but curious. My breath caught, panic flaring in my chest. "Nathan," I said quickly, crossing the room. "That's private." He looked up, startled by the sharpness in my tone. His eyes flicked to mine, and then back to the journal, his expression shifting to something softer. "Sorry," he said, closing it carefully. "I didn't mean to pry." I snatched it from his hands, clutching it to my chest as if it were something precious. My heart was racing, my cheeks hot with embarrassment. "It's nothing," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Just an old habit." Nathan studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "I didn't read much," he said, his tone quieter now. "Just a few lines. But it didn't seem like nothing." I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. The journal felt heavy in my hands, the weight of it a stark reminder of the secrets it held, memories, confessions, pieces of myself I had never shared with anyone. "It's just something I do," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "To clear my head." "I get that," he said, his voice warm, understanding. I glanced at him, surprised by the softness in his expression. Nathan had always been thoughtful, more perceptive than most, but the way he was looking at me now, curious but not intrusive, made my chest tighten. "I shouldn't have left it out," I said, hugging the journal tighter. "It's okay," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We all have things we don't want other people to see." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. For a moment I wondered what he meant, what things he kept hidden, what secrets he carried. The moment passed, and Nathan moved toward the kitchen, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "Let me know if you need help with dinner," he said over his shoulder, his tone casual again. I watched him go, my heart still racing, the journal clutched tightly to my chest. It wasn't the first time Nathan had surprised me. He had always been good at that, ever since I first met him. This boy who had grown into a man so quickly, it felt like I'd blinked and missed it. When he moved back into the house a few months ago, I told myself it was temporary, that he'd be gone again soon, off to some exciting new chapter of his life. But in the months since, his presence had changed the house in ways I hadn't anticipated. For years it had been quiet here, the kind of silence that settled deep in your bones and made you feel older than you were. After my husband passed, I had grown used to that silence, to the echo of my footsteps in the hall, to the long, empty evenings spent with nothing but a book and a glass of wine. Nathan had brought life back into the house. It was in the small things, the sound of his music drifting from upstairs, the sight of his sneakers kicked off by the door, the way he'd pop into the kitchen to chat while I cooked dinner. He filled the spaces that had felt so hollow, so empty for so long. But he also made me aware of myself, of the way I looked when I caught my reflection in the mirror, of the way my heart beat a little faster when he smiled, when he laughed, when he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me with that quiet, thoughtful gaze of his. It wasn't right. I knew that. He was my stepson, for God's sake. But knowing it didn't make it any easier to ignore. Later that evening, as I sat on the edge of my bed, the journal resting on my lap, I found myself flipping through its pages. The handwriting was neat but unsteady in places, the words raw and unfiltered. I stopped on one page, my breath catching as I read the lines I'd written weeks ago. "I miss feeling alive. I miss being seen." The truth of it hit me like a punch to the chest. For years I had buried those feelings, telling myself that it was enough to simply exist, to get through each day without falling apart. But now, with Nathan here, with the way he looked at me, spoke to me, it was harder to keep those feelings at bay. I closed the journal and set it aside, my hands trembling slightly. This was dangerous, I knew that. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to let myself be seen again. The next morning, I found Nathan in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. He was scrolling through something on his phone, the soft morning light catching in his hair and making him look younger, almost boyish. But when he looked up at me, his eyes were anything but boyish. "Morning," he said, his tone casual, though there was a faint edge to it. "Morning," I replied, avoiding his gaze as I moved to the coffee pot. My hands trembled slightly as I poured myself a cup, the events of the previous day still too fresh in my mind. I hoped he wouldn't bring it up, that we could just pretend it hadn't happened. But Nathan had never been one to let things slide. "So," he said, setting his mug down on the counter. "About yesterday." I froze, my fingers tightening around the handle of my mug. "What about it?" He shrugged, his tone light but probing. "That journal. You seemed pretty protective of it." "It's private," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. "I get that," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not trying to pry. I just—" He hesitated, his gaze softening. I couldn't help wondering what's in there that's so personal. I turned to face him, my chest tight. "Nathan, I told you, it's just something I use to clear my head. It's nothing important." His brow furrowed and he leaned forward slightly, his arms crossed over his chest. "It didn't seem like nothing," he said quietly. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't judgmental or intrusive, it was curious, concerned. "Nathan," I said softly, setting my mug down on the counter, "it's not something I'm ready to talk about." "Okay," he said after a moment, his tone gentle. "But if you ever do want to talk, I'm here." The sincerity in his voice, the way he was looking at me, it made my chest ache. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. For a moment, the silence between us stretched, heavy and charged. "I wasn't trying to make you uncomfortable," he said finally, his voice quieter now. I care about you, that's all." His words hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch. "I know you do," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Nathan hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then he nodded, picking up his mug again. "Okay," he said, his tone lighter. "I'll leave it alone." I nodded, grateful for the reprieve, but as he left the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation wasn't over. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the living room, tidying up the scattered magazines and throw pillows that seemed to multiply when Nathan was home. The journal was safely tucked away in my bedroom, but the memory of his words lingered. "I care about you." It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but this time felt different. There was a weight to it, an unspoken depth that I didn't know how to handle. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn, and I saw Nathan standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You don't have to clean up after me, you know," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's not about you," I said, though my tone lacked conviction. He stepped into the room, his movements unhurried. "You do too much," he said quietly. I rolled my eyes, trying to brush off the comment. "I'm fine, Nathan." "You always say that," he said, his tone soft but insistent. "But are you?" I froze, the question catching me off guard. "What do you mean?" I see how hard you work to hold everything together," he said, his gaze steady. "But who's taking care of you?" The sincerity in his voice, the concern in his eyes, it was too much. I looked away, focusing on the magazine in my hands. "I don't need anyone to take care of me," I said quietly. "That's not true," he said, stepping closer. "Everyone needs someone." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I turned to face him, my hands trembling slightly. "Nathan, why are you saying this?" "Because I care about you," he said simply. The room felt impossibly still, the air between us charged with something I couldn't name. "You shouldn't," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle. "Because it's not right," I said, my chest tightening. "Because I'm your stepmother." Nathan shook his head, a faint, bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "That doesn't change how I feel," he said softly. The honesty in his voice, the quiet conviction, it was overwhelming. I turned away, my hands gripping the back of the couch as I tried to steady myself. "Nathan, this can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I know it's complicated," he said. "But that doesn't mean it's not real." His words hung in the air, and I felt my resolve wavering. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, to put an end to this before it went any further. But the truth I couldn't admit, even to myself, was that he wasn't wrong. By the time evening rolled around, the tension that had been building all day felt almost unbearable. I tried to shake it off, busying myself in the kitchen with dinner. Cooking had always been my refuge. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the sizzle of oil in the pan, it gave me something to focus on, something tangible to control. But tonight, even that wasn't enough. Nathan appeared in the doorway just as I was setting the table. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his expression softer than it had been earlier. "Need any help?" he asked. I shook my head, keeping my eyes on the plates I was arranging. "No, it's all done." He stepped inside anyway, grabbing the silverware and placing it next to the plates. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though he was searching for an excuse to stay close. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable, and I found myself glancing at him as he worked. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his posture, that made it hard to look away. "Thanks," I said softly, breaking the silence. Nathan looked up, his lips curving into a small smile. "For what?" "For helping," I said, though the words felt too simple for what I really meant. "Anytime," he said, his voice warm. We sat down to eat, and for a while the conversation was light. We talked about small things, his plans for the week, a show he'd started watching, the weather. But as the meal went on, the casual ease between us began to give way to something deeper. "You've been quiet today," he said, his tone gentle. I looked at him, startled by the sudden shift. "I guess I've had a lot on my mind," I admitted. "Care to share?" he asked, his gaze steady. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my glass. "It's nothing important," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. Nathan leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You're allowed to have things on your mind. You know," he said softly, "you don't always have to carry everything by yourself." The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at me as though he could see straight through me, it was disarming. "I'm used to it," I said, trying to sound casual. "That doesn't mean you should be," he said, his tone firm but kind. I looked down at my plate, unable to meet his gaze. "It's just hard to talk about some things," I said quietly. Nathan didn't respond right away, and when I finally glanced up, his expression was softer, his eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said. "But if you ever want to, I'm here." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, and I felt my breath catch. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Nathan stretched out on the couch, his head resting against the arm, while I curled up in the armchair with a mug of tea. The soft glow of the lamp bathed the room in a warm light, and the distant hum of the cicadas outside added a soothing rhythm to the quiet. "I remember sitting here with Dad," Nathan said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I looked up, startled by the mention of his father. "You do?" He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, he used to sit right there," he said, gesturing to the armchair where I was sitting, reading the newspaper or watching the game. A pang of bittersweet nostalgia settled in my chest. "He loved this room," I said softly. Nathan nodded, his expression turning wistful. "I miss him," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Me too," I said, the words catching in my throat. For a while, we sat in silence, the weight of shared grief settling over us. It wasn't heavy or suffocating, but rather a quiet, mutual understanding that bound us together in a way nothing else could. "I don't know how you did it," Nathan said suddenly, his gaze fixed on me. "Did what?" I asked, confused. "Held everything together after he passed," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "I was barely keeping it together, and you were just there. For me, for everyone." The sincerity in his voice, the admiration in his eyes, it was overwhelming. "I didn't have a choice," I said softly. "Someone had to." "Yeah," he said, his tone gentle. "But that doesn't mean it was easy." I looked away, my chest tight. "It wasn't," I admitted. Nathan sat up then, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said quietly. The words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my eyes sting with unshed tears. "Nathan, I hesitated, unsure of what to say. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. The touch was brief but grounding, steadying me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "I'm here," he said softly. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his tone, it was too much. I nodded, unable to speak, and let the silence settle around us once again. As the night deepened, the tension between us grew heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. And though we didn't speak of it, I knew we were both thinking the same thing. The house was silent when I woke later that night, the kind of stillness that presses against your skin and amplifies every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Nathan's words over and over in my head. I see you, and I care about you, more than you realize. My chest ached with the weight of it, a confusing mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. There was warmth in his words, yes, but also danger. A kind of unspoken invitation that I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet brushing against the cool floor. Sleep wasn't coming, not with my mind racing like this. I pulled on my robe and made my way downstairs, hoping that maybe a cup of tea would help quiet the storm inside me. The kitchen was dimly lit, the faint glow from the under-cabinet lights casting soft shadows across the counters. I moved quietly, not wanting to disturb the stillness. But as I reached for the kettle, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. I turned, startled, to find Nathan standing in the doorway. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice low, careful. I shook my head, my hand still resting on the kettle. No? Same, he said, stepping into the room. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled, his expression softer in the low light. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. Want some tea? I offered, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, moving to lean against the counter as I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The faint hum of the burner filled the space, a quiet background to the tension lingering between us. What's on your mind? Nathan asked after a moment, his tone gentle but probing. I glanced at him, startled by the question. What do you mean? You've been distant, he said, choosing his words carefully. Since dinner. Since earlier today, really. I turned away, focusing on the kettle as though it held all the answers. I've just had a lot to think about, I said softly. Like what? He pressed, his voice quiet but insistent. I hesitated, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. Like us, I admitted finally, the words trembling as they left my lips. Nathan didn't respond right away, and when I finally turned to look at him, his expression was unreadable. What about us? He asked, his tone steady. I let out a shaky breath, my chest tightening. Nathan, whatever this is, it's complicated, and I don't know how to handle it. He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. It doesn't have to be, he said softly. Yes, it does, I said quickly, my voice breaking, because it's not just about what we feel, there are rules, boundaries. Boundaries that don't change the truth, he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. I stared at him, my heart pounding. And what truth is that? That I care about you, he said, stepping even closer. That I see you, really see you, in a way I don't think anyone else has in a long time. His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt tears sting at the corners of my eyes. You shouldn't say things like that, I whispered, my voice trembling. Why not? He asked gently. Because they're true? I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The intensity in his eyes, the raw vulnerability in his voice. It was too much. Nathan, I began, my voice faltering. But before I could finish, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was warm, steady, grounding me even as I felt like I might fall apart. You don't have to say anything, he said softly. Just don't shut me out. The quiet plea in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, it broke something in me. I felt the tears spill over, hot and unrelenting. And before I knew what I was doing, I stepped closer, my head bowing as I tried to catch my breath. Nathan didn't hesitate. He pulled me into his arms, his embrace warm and steady, and I clung to him like a lifeline. It's okay, he murmured, his voice a soothing whisper against my hair. You're not alone. The words broke me completely, and I sobbed against his chest, the weight of everything I'd been holding back finally spilling over. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I felt heard. And as Nathan held me, his hands gentle, his presence unwavering, I let myself believe, just for a moment, that maybe I didn't have to carry it all alone. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Nathan's arms were still wrapped around me, steady and warm, and I couldn't bring myself to move. His embrace felt too safe, too solid, as though letting go would mean unraveling completely. "You've been holding this in for a long time, haven't you?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded against his chest, the words too tangled in my throat to speak. "You don't have to carry everything on your own," he said, his hands gently rubbing small circles against my back. "You never did." The truth of his words settled over me, heavy and unrelenting. For so long, I'd convinced myself that being strong meant bearing everything in silence. But here, in Nathan's arms, I felt the weight begin to shift, the cracks in my armor widening. When I finally pulled back, his hands lingered on my arms, his touch grounding me. I looked up at him, my breath hitching at the intensity in his gaze. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice trembling. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his tone firm but gentle. "I care about you. You don't have to do this alone." The way he looked at me, steady, unwavering, made my chest tighten. There was no judgment in his eyes, no hesitation, just quiet understanding. I took a shaky breath, stepping back to put some distance between us. "I should make that tea," I said, my voice unsteady. Nathan didn't stop me as I turned back to the counter, but I could feel his eyes on me, the tension between us palpable. I busied myself with the kettle, my hands trembling as I poured the hot water over the tea bags. "You don't have to talk about it," he said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. "But I hope you know I'm here. Whenever you're ready." I swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill again. "I know," I said quietly, "and that means more than you realize." I handed him a mug, our fingers brushing briefly as he took it. The touch sent a shiver through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, afraid of what he might see in my face. "Thanks," he said, his tone soft. We moved to the living room, settling into our usual spots, me on the couch, Nathan in the armchair. The warm glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the room, and the tea in my hands provided a welcome distraction from the weight of his presence. For a while we sat in silence, the quiet between us filled with something I couldn't quite name. I could feel his eyes on me, could sense the questions he wasn't asking, and it made my heart race in a way I wasn't prepared for. "You're different when you're with me," Nathan said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze steady. "You let your guard down. You're softer." The comment made my cheeks flush, and I looked away, focusing on the steam rising from my mug. "That's not true," I said quietly. "It is," he insisted, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to hide so much with me. You don't have to pretend." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction, made something inside me ache. "I've been pretending for so long," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he studied me. "Why?" "Because it's easier," I said softly. "Because if I let myself feel everything, I don't know if I'll be able to keep going." "You don't have to hold it all in," he said, his voice steady. "Not with me." I looked at him then, my chest tightening at the intensity in his gaze. The space between us felt impossibly small, even though we weren't touching, and I could feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on me. "You make it sound so simple," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe it is," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Or maybe you just make it harder than it needs to be." I let out a shaky laugh, the sound catching in my throat. "You don't know what you're asking of me." "I'm asking you to let yourself be happy," he said simply. The quiet honesty in his voice, the warmth in his expression, it was too much. I looked away, my hands tightening around the mug in my lap. "You deserve that," he continued, his tone softer now. "You deserve to feel alive again." His words hit me like a blow, and I felt the tears rising again. I blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back, but when I looked up at him, his expression softened even further. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to decide anything right now. Just don't shut me out." The plea in his voice, the quiet vulnerability, made my heart ache. "I won't," I whispered, my voice breaking. Nathan leaned back, his gaze still on me, but he didn't press further. The tension between us had shifted, softening into something quieter, something fragile but unyielding. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The storm rolled in that evening, the rain starting as a soft patter against the windows before building into a steady, insistent rhythm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, soothing sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I stood in the kitchen, staring out at the darkened sky as I absently dried the last of the dishes. The house felt warmer than usual, the lights casting a golden glow over the quiet rooms. But it did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. Nathan had been in the living room for most of the evening, the faint sound of the television filtering through the house. I had been avoiding him, not intentionally, I told myself, but because I needed space to think. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, I couldn't stop replaying his words from the night before. You deserve to feel alive again. The truth of it had settled deep in my chest, too heavy to ignore. I had spent so long trying to convince myself that what I felt didn't matter, that my needs were secondary, irrelevant. But Nathan had seen through that. And now, I couldn't unsee it myself. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn, and I found Nathan standing in the doorway. His hair was slightly damp, as though he'd just showered, and he was dressed in a plain black t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked comfortable, relaxed, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that sent a shiver through me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, craning back to the sink. "Yes. Just cleaning up." "You've been in here for a while," he said, stepping into the room. "I needed something to do," I admitted, my hands tightening on the dish towel. Nathan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, his tone gentle but direct. I froze, my breath catching. "I haven't." "You have?" he interrupted, though there was no accusation in his voice. "And I get it, I do, but I wish you wouldn't." I turned to look at him, my chest tight. "Nathan, this is complicated." "I know it is," he said, stepping closer, "but avoiding it isn't going to make it any less complicated." The honesty in his voice, the quiet conviction in his expression, it was overwhelming. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said, his tone steady. "Just let me in, that's all I'm asking." His words broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I blurted, "I'm scared." Nathan's brow furrowed, and he took another step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. "Of what?" "Of everything," I said, my voice cracking. "Of what this means, of what people would think, of what happens if I let myself feel this." Nathan's fingers tightened slightly on my arm, his touch grounding me. "Do you think I'm not scared too?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. I looked up at him, startled by the raw emotion in his eyes. "I've thought about this every day since I moved back here," he admitted. "About what it means, about what it says about me, about us. But the one thing I keep coming back to is that it's real. This, what I feel for you. It's real, and I think you feel it too." His words left me breathless, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. "Nathan, tell me I'm wrong," he said softly, his gaze searching mine. "And I'll stop. I'll walk away right now, and I won't bring it up again." I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. I wanted to say it, to deny everything, to put an end to this before it went any further. But I couldn't, because he wasn't wrong. Instead of speaking, I reached up, my fingers trembling as they brushed against his cheek. The warmth of his skin, the way he leaned into my touch, it was enough to unravel me completely. Nathan didn't wait. He closed the distance between us, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands clutching the fabric of his shirt as the kiss deepened. The world seemed to fall away, the storm outside nothing more than a distant hum. All that mattered was the feel of his lips on mine, the way his hands steadied me as though he knew I might collapse. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths were ragged, our foreheads resting together. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Maybe," he said, his tone soft, "but it's ours." The weight of his words, the quiet certainty in his voice, it made my chest ache with something I couldn't name. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The morning came slowly, the pale light of dawn creeping into the room and painting everything in muted shades of gray and gold. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the night before replaying in my mind with startling clarity. Nathan's touch, his voice, the way he'd looked at me as though I were the only thing in the world that mattered. It all lingered, filling the quiet with a weight I couldn't escape. I knew I should feel regret, guilt, something that told me what we'd done was wrong. But instead, all I felt was the steady thrum of my heart and the faint, fragile bloom of something I hadn't dared to feel in years: hope. I slipped out of bed, the cool floor beneath my feet grounding me as I made my way to the kitchen. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes only in the earliest hours of the day. I busied myself with making coffee, the familiar routine calming the storm inside me. As I poured the steaming liquid into a mug, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. "Morning," Nathan said, his voice low and slightly husky from sleep. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. He looked at me with a softness that made my chest tighten, and I had to look away, focusing instead on stirring cream into my coffee. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. Nathan stepped into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "Couldn't sleep?" I shook my head, taking a sip of coffee to steady myself. "No, you?" "Not much," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Kept thinking about last night." His words sent a shiver through me, and I set the mug down on the counter, my hands trembling slightly. "Nathan, about last night?" "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, his tone gentle but firm. "I know it's a lot to process. I need you to know that I don't regret it." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction, it was almost too much. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to do anything right now," he said softly. "But I don't want you to think this was a mistake. It wasn't, not to me." I looked at him then, my chest tightening at the raw honesty in his expression. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice breaking. "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But we'll figure it out. Together." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Nathan, this changes everything," I whispered. "Maybe it does," he said. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." The quiet confidence in his voice, the way he looked at me as though he believed every word, it was enough to make my resolve falter. I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "I don't want to hurt you," I said softly. "You're not," he said, his hand brushing against mine. "You couldn't." The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence, it was overwhelming. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. But then the weight of reality settled over me, and I pulled my hand back, the loss of his touch leaving a hollow ache in its wake. "I need time," I said quietly, my voice trembling. Nathan nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but unyielding. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Later that morning, after Nathan had left for a walk, I sat by the window with my coffee, staring out at the garden. The storm from the night before had left everything damp and glistening, the sunlight breaking through the clouds in soft, golden rays. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier, as though it were holding its breath. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The years of loneliness, the quiet ache of moving through life without someone to lean on. Nathan's presence had shaken something loose in me, something I'd buried so deeply, I hadn't even realized it was there. But what did it mean? What did it say about me, that I had let it happen, that I hadn't stopped it when I should have? I ran my fingers along the edge of the table, the same table where everything had changed. My chest ached with the weight of it all, guilt, fear, longing, and a strange, tentative hope that I didn't know how to hold. Maybe Nathan was right. Maybe I didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to simply feel. When Nathan returned, the tension between us was quieter, softer, like the aftermath of a storm. He didn't press me, didn't ask for answers I wasn't ready to give. Instead, he simply sat with me, the unspoken understanding between us enough to fill the silence. As the day went on, I found myself thinking less about the risks and more about the possibilities, about what it might mean to let myself be happy again, even if it was complicated. The path ahead was uncertain, the future blurred and undefined. But as Nathan's hand brushed against mine, a faint smile tugging at his lips, I felt something shift. Hope. It happened in an instant, but it felt like the world slowed down. I was heading toward the laundry room carrying a stack of folded towels when Zachary appeared from the bathroom, a towel slung low around his hips, steam rising from his skin. "Hey, Charlotte," he said casually, stepping aside to let me pass. I glanced at him briefly, muttering a polite, "Hi," before trying to focus on the task at hand. But then it happened. The knot of his towel slipped, and before either of us could react, it dropped to the floor. He froze, and so did I. My gaze flickered, just for a second, a reflex I couldn't stop, and in that moment, I saw him in a way I was never supposed to. He started, his voice breaking the silence as he bent to grab the towel. "I didn't see anything," I blurted out, turning away so fast that I nearly dropped the towels I was holding. "Right," he said, his voice strained. "Sorry about that." By the time I dared to look back, he had wrapped the towel around himself again, his cheeks as red as mine probably were. Neither of us said anything else, but the air between us felt heavier, like we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. It was an accident. Just a fleeting, awkward moment. But as I walked away, my heart racing and my skin flushed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Life with Richard had always been predictable. Our marriage wasn't a love story. It was a partnership, practical and stable. He was a businessman through and through, his focus always on the next deal, the next client, the next opportunity. I'd admired that about him at first, his drive, his ambition. But over time, it left little room for us. The house was large and modern, perched on the edge of the countryside. Its sleek lines and polished surfaces were more Richard's taste than mine, but I made it a home as best as I could. Most days, though, it felt too big, too quiet. Richard spent more time at work than here, and when he was home, he was usually buried in emails or conference calls. Zachary moved in shortly after finishing college. At 24, he was in that uncertain stage of life, searching for direction while trying to figure out who he was. Richard insisted he stay with us until he got on his feet, though I suspected it had more to do with control than concern. Richard had always been critical of Zachary, pushing him toward paths that didn't fit, trying to mold him into the son he wanted rather than the one he had. I hadn't spent much time around Zachary before he moved in. He'd lived with his mother, Karen, on the other side of the country for most of his life. When Richard and I married, Zachary was a quiet teenager who barely looked up from his phone long enough to say hello. But the man who walked through the door that day was someone entirely different. Zachary was tall and broad-shouldered, with an easy confidence that belied the uncertainty of his circumstances. His dark hair was perpetually tousled, and his blue eyes had a way of looking right through you, like he could see things you didn't want him to. At first, our interactions were polite but distant. He spent most of his time in his room or out with friends, and I didn't press him to engage. But as the weeks went on, he started spending more time around the house, finding reasons to linger in the kitchen while I cooked, or joining me in the living room while I read. "Your garden is impressive," he said one afternoon, leaning against the patio door as I tended to the roses. "Thank you," I replied, glancing up at him. "It's been a lot of work, but it's worth it." He stepped outside, squinting against the sunlight. "Do you do all of this yourself?" "Mostly," I said, brushing dirt off my gloves. "Richard isn't exactly the gardening type," Zachary smirked. "I can't imagine him getting his hands dirty." I laughed softly, surprised by how easily he made me smile. "That's not his style." It was small moments like that, little exchanges that didn't seem like much at the time, that began to shift something between us. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way he moved through the house, the sound of his laughter, the way his presence filled the space in a way that Richard's never did. And then there were the times I'd catch him looking at me. Quick glances that lingered a beat too long before he looked away. The day of the towel incident was like any other. I had spent the morning tidying up and sorting laundry, my usual routine when Richard was at the office. I wasn't expecting Zachary to be home. He'd mentioned something about meeting a friend for lunch. I was heading toward the laundry room when the bathroom door opened, and he stepped out, a cloud of steam following him. His towel was slung low around his hips, his skin still damp from the shower. "Hey, Charlotte," he said casually as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "Hi," I replied, averting my eyes as I moved past him. And then it happened. The towel slipped, the knot unraveling, and before either of us could react, it fell to the floor. For a moment, neither of us moved. Zachary froze, his eyes wide, and I felt my cheeks flush as I realized what had just happened. Sorry, he stammered, bending down to grab the towel. I didn't see anything, I blurted out, though the heat rising in my face betrayed me. Right, he said, his voice strained as he wrapped the towel around himself again. I hurried away, my heart racing, and my thoughts a jumble of embarrassment and something else I didn't want to name. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. It was just an accident, I told myself. A fleeting, awkward moment that meant nothing. But the tension that lingered in the air said otherwise. When I saw him later that evening, sitting on the couch with his laptop, he looked up and gave me a small, tentative smile. I returned it, though my heart fluttered in a way that felt dangerous. We didn't speak about what had happened, but the unspoken awareness between us was impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, the dynamic between us shifted. Our conversations grew longer, our glances more frequent. There was a new weight to the air whenever we were alone, a quiet tension that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. Richard remained oblivious, too caught up in his work to notice the subtle changes in the house. But I noticed. And so did Zachary. The incident with the towel might have been an accident, but the weight of it lingered in every interaction between us. Zachary and I had shared an awkward moment, but it was more than that. It had ignited something neither of us could name, but both of us could feel. In the days that followed, the tension between us grew. It wasn't something we spoke about, but it was there, in the way his gaze lingered when we passed each other, in the charged silence that hung in the air when we found ourselves alone. I told myself it was nothing, a silly infatuation born out of loneliness and too much time spent together. But deep down, I knew better. It happened for the first time one evening. Richard was working late, as usual, and the house was quiet. I was in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner, when Zachary walked in. He leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my hands tremble. "You don't have to do everything yourself, you know," he said, his voice softer than usual. I glanced at him, forcing a smile. "It keeps me busy." He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You're always busy." "Someone has to be," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. Zachary didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached out, taking the dish towel from my hands. His fingers brushed mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me. "You never let anyone take care of you," he said quietly. His words caught me off guard, and I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "Zachary, But I couldn't finish the sentence. His gaze held mine, steady and unrelenting, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The first kiss was tentative, a quiet question neither of us dared to speak aloud. His lips brushed mine, soft and hesitant, and for a moment I froze. But then I kissed him back, and the floodgates opened. We pulled apart after a moment, both of us breathing heavily. "This is wrong," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, his forehead resting against mine. "But I can't stop." Neither could I. What started as stolen moments in the kitchen quickly spiraled into something neither of us could control. We were careful at first, stealing glances and fleeting touches when no one else was around. But as the weeks went on, the intensity of our connection grew, and so did the risks we were willing to take. One afternoon, while Richard was at a client meeting, Zachary found me in the garden. I was pruning roses, the warm sun beating down on my back, when he appeared behind me. "You're always out here," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. "It's peaceful," I replied without turning around. Zachary stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "You're beautiful out here," he said softly. I turned to face him, my breath catching as I saw the way he was looking at me, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. "Zachary, we shouldn't." But before I could finish, he pulled me into his arms, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that left me breathless. The secrecy of our relationship only added to its intensity. We found ways to be together without raising suspicion. Quiet moments in the library, whispered conversations in the kitchen, fleeting touches in the garden. Every stolen moment felt like a rebellion against the roles we were supposed to play, a defiance of the rules that bound us. But the risks were always there. lurking in the background. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the sound of Richard's car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of panic through both of us. "Go," I whispered, pushing Zachary toward the hallway. He slipped out just as the front door opened, and I quickly composed myself, pretending to read a book. "Miranda," Richard said as he walked in, his tone brisk. "Where's Zachary?" "In his room, I think," I replied, forcing a casual smile. Richard frowned but didn't press further, his attention already shifting to his laptop. The cracks in our secret began to show soon after. It started with small things. Richard's puzzled glances when he noticed Zachary and me talking in hushed tones, the way he lingered in doorways as if trying to catch something we weren't saying. Then there was Noah, Zachary's best friend, who had a way of showing up unannounced. "You've been spending a lot of time at home," Noah remarked one afternoon, his tone light but his gaze sharp. "Just helping out around the house." Zachary replied smoothly. Noah raised an eyebrow, his smirk faint. "Must be nice." The remark seemed innocuous, but the way his eyes flicked between us left me uneasy. The pressure of keeping our secret began to take its toll. One night, as we sat in the library, Zachary reached for my hand, his expression pained. "We can't keep hiding forever," he said. I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "There's no other way." "There has to be," he insisted. "I'm not going to lose you, Charlotte." The conviction in his voice both comforted and terrified me. Our relationship was a delicate balancing act, one misstep away from disaster. But even as the risks grew, so did my feelings for him. I knew it couldn't last. But I also knew I couldn't let go. Secrets are heavy things, and as much as I tried to keep ours hidden, it began to seep into the cracks of our lives. The weight of what Zachary and I were doing wasn't just emotional. It was practical, tangible, a constant presence in the house. And the closer others got, the more I felt the walls closing in. The first complication came in the form of Noah, Zachary's best friend. Noah had a knack for showing up unannounced, his sharp wit and easy smile masking a subtle nosiness that made me uneasy. He seemed to have a sixth sense for tension, and every time he was in the house, I felt like I was walking on glass. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Noah wandered in, his usual air of casual charm surrounding him. "Smells good in here," he said, leaning against the counter. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone polite. He picked up an apple from the fruit bowl, tossing it in the air before taking a bite. "Zach's been spending a lot of time at home lately," he remarked, his gaze flicking to me. "He's helping me with some projects," I said, forcing a smile. "Nice of him," Noah said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Guess it's good to have some company with Richard gone so much." The comment sent a jolt through me, but I kept my expression neutral. "It's a big house," I replied. "Company is always nice." Noah studied me for a moment longer before grinning. "Well, I hope he's not slacking off too much. Zach's always been good at finding distractions." I laughed lightly, but the unease in my chest didn't fade. Then there was Cynthia, one of Richard's colleagues who had taken an unexpected interest in Zachary. Cynthia was everything I wasn't: young, ambitious, and unapologetically bold. She worked closely with Richard, often attending events and meetings with him, and she seemed to delight in making herself part of his world. "Zachary's quite charming, isn't he?" she remarked one evening during a dinner party at our house. I glanced at her, surprised by the comment. "He is," I replied carefully. She sipped her wine, her eyes glinting with amusement. "I think he's wasted sitting around here. Someone like him should be out there, making his mark." "I'm sure he'll find his way," I said, my tone clipped. Cynthia leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I can see where he gets it from. You've got quite the presence yourself, Charlotte." Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I excused myself as soon as I could. The pressure of keeping our secret grew with each passing day. Little things began to slip. Glances held too long, touches that lingered, the way Zachary's voice softened when he spoke to me. One evening, as I was tidying up the living room, Richard walked in unexpectedly. "You've been distracted lately," he said, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "I've just been busy," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "Too busy to join me for dinner the other night?" he pressed. "I wasn't feeling well," I lied, my stomach twisting under his scrutiny. Richard studied me for a moment before nodding. "Well, Let me know if there's anything I can do. His words seemed kind on the surface, but the edge in his tone left me unsettled. The breaking point came when Noah and Cynthia crossed paths at the house. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the garden pruning roses when I heard their voices drifting from the patio. "Zach's been spending a lot of time here," Noah was saying, his tone casual but probing. "He's helping out around the house," Cynthia replied, her voice light, "and keeping Charlotte company, from what I hear." My heart stopped, and I froze, straining to hear their conversation. "That's interesting," Noah said, his tone shifting slightly. "They do seem close." "Don't read too much into it," Cynthia replied with a laugh. "Charlotte's just lonely. Richard's never around." Their words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. That evening, as Zachary and I sat in the library, I told him about what I'd overheard. "They're starting to notice," I said, my voice trembling. "Let them," Zachary replied, his tone firm. "They don't know anything. They're guessing, and it's only a matter of time before they figure it out," I said, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Zachary took my hand, his gaze steady. "We'll deal with it when it happens. I'm not letting them take this away from us." His confidence was reassuring, but the knot of fear in my chest refused to ease. The next week, Richard confronted me. "I got a call from Cynthia," he said, as he stood in the doorway of our bedroom, his arms crossed. "What about?" I asked, my heart racing. "She said there's been talk about you and Zachary," Richard said, his tone calm but cold. "Talk?" I repeated, feigning confusion. "People are saying you're too close," he said, his eyes narrowing. "That's ridiculous," I said quickly. "Zachary is your son. I've only ever tried to help him." Richard stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "Are you sure about that, Charlotte?" My breath caught, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. "Yes." The silence between us was suffocating, but eventually, Richard nodded. "Good, because if I find out otherwise, there will be consequences." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and as he walked away, I felt the weight of his warning settle heavily on my shoulders. The pressure was mounting, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Noah's intuition, Cynthia's prying, Richard's suspicion. It all felt like a storm gathering on the horizon, and I wasn't sure if we could survive it. But even as the risks grew, so did my feelings for Zachary. And no matter how dangerous it became, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. By the time the storm finally broke, I could feel it brewing in every corner of the house. The tension was unbearable, thick enough to suffocate. It wasn't just the glances Richard was beginning to cast my way, or the subtle, loaded remarks from Cynthia and Noah. It was the way Zachary and I were fraying under the pressure. Secrets like ours don't stay hidden for long. It started with Richard's sudden interest in being home. He began coming home earlier than usual, often appearing in the kitchen or living room at odd hours, claiming he wanted to spend more time with his family. But his presence wasn't warm or comforting. It was calculated. I could feel his eyes on me, watching for cracks in my composure, waiting for me to slip. One evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, Richard walked in and leaned against the counter. "Zachary hasn't been around much today," he remarked, his tone casual but probing. "He went into town to run errands," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Funny how he seems to disappear when I'm home," Richard said, his gaze sharp. I froze for a fraction of a second before forcing myself to continue arranging the silverware. "I'm sure that's just a coincidence," Richard hummed thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. "Coincidences have a way of piling up." The next blow came from Noah. He showed up late one evening, unannounced as usual, but this time his demeanor was different. He wasn't his usual charming, carefree self. Instead, he seemed tense, his eyes darting around the house as though searching for something. "Is Zach here?" he asked as I opened the door. "He's in his room," I said cautiously. Noah nodded, stepping inside. "Mind if I wait for him?" "Of course not," I said, though my chest tightened. As Noah sat in the living room, his gaze flicked to me. "You know, Charlotte, you've been good for Zach. He seems happier since moving in." "Thank you," I said, my voice steady despite the unease creeping through me. "But sometimes," Noah continued, leaning back on the couch, "I wonder if it's you he's staying here for, and not his dad." The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out, and I struggled to maintain my composure. What are you implying, Noah? He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. Just an observation. Zach talks about you a lot, more than I'd expect. Before I could respond, Zachary appeared at the top of the stairs. Noah, he said sharply, his tone warning. Noah looked up, his smirk widening. Hey man, just catching up with Charlotte. Let's go, Zachary said, his jaw tight. As they left, I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling. Things came to a head when Richard finally confronted me. It was late, and I was in the library, pretending to read while my mind raced with worry. Richard walked in, his footsteps heavy, and shut the door behind him. We need to talk, he said, his voice cold. I set the book down, my heart pounding. What's this about? He stepped closer, his eyes dark with suspicion. Cynthia and Noah have been saying some interesting things about you and Zachary. Richard, you're not seriously listening to them, are you? I said, feigning indignation. You tell me, he snapped, his voice rising. Are they lying, or is there something going on between you and my son? I stood, my chest tightening. How dare you accuse me of something like that? Don't play innocent, Charlotte, he growled. I see the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him. My breath caught, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. You're paranoid. Maybe if you spent more time paying attention to this family instead of your business, you wouldn't be jumping to ridiculous conclusions. Richard's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, the door opened, and Zachary stepped inside. What's going on? He asked, his voice steady but tense. Your father seems to think there's something inappropriate happening between us, I said, my voice trembling. Zachary's eyes flicked to Richard, his expression hardening. That's ridiculous. Is it? Richard challenged, stepping toward him. You've been acting strange for months, both of you. What am I supposed to think? You're supposed to trust your wife, Zachary shot back, but clearly you'd rather believe gossip. The room was thick with tension, and for a moment, none of us spoke. Then Richard turned to me, his eyes cold. If I find out there's any truth to this, Charlotte, you'll regret it. He stormed out, leaving Zachary and me alone. I sank into the chair, my hands shaking as Zachary knelt in front of me. This can't go on, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice firm. I won't let him do this to you. He's going to find out, I said, my voice breaking. And when he does, Zachary cupped my face in his hands, his gaze steady. Let him. I don't care anymore. I'm not going to lose you. His words were both comforting and terrifying, and as he pulled me into his arms, I knew we were running out of time. The next day, Richard announced that he was taking a week off work, a rare occurrence that sent a jolt of panic through me. Time to focus on what's important, he said, his gaze lingering on me as he spoke. I knew what he meant. He was going to watch us, wait for us to slip. And when we did, there would be no turning back. The week that followed was a quiet war, fought in the halls of the house. Richard's presence was suffocating, his every move calculated to keep me on edge. He spent his days shadowing us, his eyes sharp and his questions pointed. Every interaction with Zachary felt like a minefield, every word a potential spark that could ignite the tension simmering beneath the surface. The breaking point came late one evening. Richard had retired to his office, claiming he needed to review some documents. I was in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of tea I hadn't touched, when Zachary appeared. He didn't speak at first, but the weight of his presence was enough to draw my attention. We can't keep doing this, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Zachary stepped closer, his expression resolute. I'm not letting him control you like this. He's your father, I said, my voice trembling. He stopped being my father the moment he chose power over family, Zachary replied, his tone sharp. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Richard appeared in the doorway, his gaze flicking between us. What's going on here? He asked, his voice calm but deadly. Nothing, I said quickly, stepping back. Richard's eyes narrowed. Is that so? Because it doesn't look like nothing. Maybe you should ask yourself why you're so paranoid, Zachary said, his voice steady but laced with anger. Richard turned to him, his expression darkening. Watch your tone. Or what? Zachary challenged, stepping forward. You'll blame her for your failures again? That's all you ever do, isn't it? Blame everyone else for what you've ruined. Enough, Richard barked, his voice echoing through the kitchen. You think I don't see what's going on here? You think I'm blind? The silence that followed was deafening. I stepped between them, my hands trembling. Richard, please. Don't, he snapped, his gaze burning into me. Don't you dare defend him. Zachary grabbed my arm, pulling me behind him. She doesn't need to defend me. You're the one who's wrong here. Get out of my house, Richard said, his voice low and venomous. Zachary replied, his tone defiant. This is my family, my home, Richard said, his voice rising. And I will not let you destroy it. You already did? Zachary shot back. Long before I came back. The words hung in the air, and for a moment none of us spoke. Then Richard turned to me, his expression hard. You have a choice to make, Charlotte, he said coldly. Him or me. My heart pounded as I looked between them, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I knew that no matter what I chose, everything would change. I can't do this anymore, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I won't live like this. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving behind the life I had built for the uncertain future that lay ahead. The night I walked away, the air outside was cold and biting. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in that house another moment. Zachary followed silently, his footsteps steady behind me as we left everything we knew behind. We didn't speak until we reached the car. I stood there, my breath visible in the night air, my hands trembling as I clutched my coat tightly around me. You don't have to do this, Zachary said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to him, tears spilling down my cheeks. What choice do I have? Staying means pretending that everything is fine when it's not. I can't keep lying, Zachary. Not to him, not to myself. He nodded, his jaw tightening. Then we'll figure it out. Together. I didn't respond, but I let him guide me into the passenger seat. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The days that followed were a blur. We rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would think to look for us. The cabin was modest, with creaky floors and mismatched furniture, but it felt like a refuge, a space untouched by the chaos we had left behind. Zachary threw himself into finding work, his determination unwavering. I spent my days trying to piece together a sense of normalcy, but the weight of what I had done hung over me like a shadow. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Zachary reached for my hand. Are you okay? He asked, his voice gentle. I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know if I'll ever be okay again. He squeezed my hand, his grip firm. You will be. We both will. But the world doesn't let go of scandals so easily. A week after we left, my phone buzzed with messages and missed calls. The headlines were brutal. Business tycoon's wife abandons family home amid rumors of affair with stepson. Richard's statement to the press was cold and calculated. I am focusing on moving forward, he had said, his tone heavy with implied betrayal. I stared at the article, my heart sinking. No matter how far we ran, the world would never forget what we had done. Zachary found me on the porch later that evening, the tablet with the article still in my lap. You can't let them control you, he said firmly, sitting beside me. It's not just about me, I replied, my voice trembling. It's about you too. They'll never stop judging us. Let them, he said, his gaze steady. They don't matter. What matters is what we have. I looked at him, his face lit by the soft glow of the porch light, and for the first time, I let myself believe that he might be right. As the weeks turned into months, we began to carve out a new life. It wasn't easy. The whispers followed us wherever we went, and there were days when the guilt threatened to consume me. But Zachary was always there, his presence a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. One evening, as we sat by the fire, he looked at me and smiled. I don't regret it, he said simply. Regret what? I asked, though I already knew. Any of it, he replied. Leaving, fighting, choosing you. I smiled faintly, the weight on my chest lifting just a little. I don't either.